The tense atmosphere of the courtroom loomed heavily in the air. The judge flipped through papers briskly, skimming over the charges she encountered daily. Suddenly, a familiar face caught her eye. A black man was escorted in, restrained. Their eyes met, both filled with shock and disbelief. What happened next might leave you stunned. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The courtroom was alive with its usual symphony of tension, attorneys shuffling papers, murmured conversations drifting between the rows of spectators, and the distant echo of a gavel striking in an adjacent chamber. Judge Amelia Carter adjusted her posture on the bench, her polished demeanor as steady as the oak gavel resting beside her. Another day, another case, she thought, her mind already scanning through the docket with practiced efficiency. The bailiff's voice cut through the hum. Case number 1269, the State of Louisiana versus Michael Lewis. Amelia glanced down at the file before her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A pang of familiar disappointment flickered through her. Another case. Another life tangled in the system. Her voice, calm and even, filled the room. Bring the defendant forward. The heavy doors opened, and the man was escorted in, his wrists and ankles shackled. Amelia glanced up, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her was Michael Lewis. Not just any defendant. This was Michael, her Michael. A flood of memories hit her like a tidal wave, vivid and unrelenting. The summer days spent racing their bikes down the dusty streets of their small Dallas neighborhood. Sneaking into the woods behind the old train tracks. Whispered conversations under the glow of fireflies. Sharing dreams of escaping the constraints of their small, judgmental town. Michael Lewis, the boy who had once been her best friend, her partner in every childhood adventure, now stood before her in chains. His face, aged with the weight of years and hardship, bore little resemblance to the carefree boy she remembered. But those eyes, deep, piercing, and defiant, had not changed. Michael's gaze swept across the room, and when their eyes met, a flicker of recognition passed through him. He froze, his lips parting slightly as if to speak. But just as quickly, his expression hardened, his head bowing under the weight of resignation. Amelia's fingers tightened around the edges of the bench, her polished exterior threatening to crack for the first time in her career. She forced herself to take a steadying breath. This is your courtroom. You are a judge. Be impartial. She picked up the gavel, her voice steady, though she felt her heart racing. Michael Lewis, you are charged with assault and robbery. How do you plead? Michael's voice, gravelly and subdued, echoed in the courtroom. Not guilty, Your Honor. Amelia's grip faltered, the gavel slipping slightly from her hand. Memories flashed again, Michael teaching her how to skip rocks by the creek, his voice saying, You gotta follow through, Amelia, or it won't. The room seemed smaller now, suffocating, the walls pressing in on her. She wanted to stop everything, demand answers. How did you get here? What happened after we drifted apart? But there was no time for questions, no space for sentimentality. She was bound by her role, her duty, her oath. Clearing her throat, Amelia nodded toward the attorneys. Prosecution, you may proceed with your opening statement. As the prosecutor began painting Michael as a violent criminal, Amelia's mind raced. She barely registered the words. Instead, her focus remained the man she had once known so well, now reduced to a case number and a list of charges. How had it come to this? The courtroom bustled around her, but for Amelia, time seemed to stand still. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was Michael. And somewhere between her past and her present, she had to find a way to navigate the truth before it was too late. The courtroom had returned to its rhythm, the prosecution laying out their case, the defense occasionally objecting, the jury listening with varying degrees of attentiveness. But for Judge Amelia Carter, the hum of legal procedure became distant, muted, as her mind drifted to a different time, a simpler time. Amelia and Michael had grown up in the same neighborhood on the outskirts of Dallas. Their world was small and tightly wound with invisible lines drawn by race, class, and expectation. Amelia's family lived in a modest but tidy brick house with a well-kept yard. Michael's home, just 3 blocks away, was more weathered, tucked behind a row of cracked pavement and overgrown trees. Yet, in their eyes, those boundaries had never mattered. They met by chance at the playground behind their elementary school, both trying to claim the last unbroken swing. Michael had grinned, his gap-toothed smile infectious. and gestured for her to take it. "Go on," he'd said, kicking a scuffed sneaker against the dirt. "Ladies first." That was the beginning. From then on they were inseparable, sneaking away to the creek that cut through the woods or to the abandoned lot where they'd built a makeshift clubhouse out of plywood and determination. They shared peanut butter sandwiches, swapped comic books, and whispered dreams of what life could be if they just got out of Dallas. Someday Amelia, Michael had said one starry summer night, lying on his back in the cool grass. "I'm gonna leave this place. I don't know where yet, but somewhere people don't judge you before they even know your name." Amelia had laughed, swatting a mosquito away. "You better take me with you." He turned to her then, his voice serious. "You'd better keep up." But life had other plans. The summer before middle school, their small town's prejudices had finally seeped into their little world. Amelia's father had caught them sitting together on the porch, their heads bent close as they examined a firefly in a jar. His voice had been sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Amelia, inside. Now." She had hesitated, glancing at Michael. His eyes met hers, a quiet resignation there that she didn't yet understand. "Go on," he'd said softly. "I'll see you tomorrow." But there was no tomorrow. Her father forbade her from spending time with Michael, forbade her from even speaking his name. Michael's family moved soon after, and Amelia, though she tried to find him, was pulled into the current of her own life school, college, law school. She never forgot him, not entirely. But as the years passed, he became a memory she kept tucked away, one she rarely revisited. Until now. "Your Honor?" The defense attorney's voice broke through Amelia's reverie. Amelia blinked, her fingers tightening around her gavel as she forced herself to focus. "Yes?" Lisa Porter, Michael's attorney, was standing at her table, her expression professional but determined. "The defense would like to call our first witness." Amelia nodded, signaling for the proceedings to continue, but her mind still churned beneath her composed exterior. As Lisa began her examination of the witness, Amelia's gaze flicked to Michael. His shoulders were hunched, his posture almost defiant, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted around the room, a mix of unease and exhaustion. He wouldn't look at her, not directly, and she didn't blame him. She had walked into her house that day, so many years ago, and let the door close on their friendship. She had moved on, chasing her ambitions, leaving Michael behind in a world that had always been stacked against him. And now, here he was, fighting for his freedom in her courtroom. Amelia shifted in her seat, her heart heavy. She had spent her career upholding the law, believing in the justice system's ability to sort right from wrong. But now, she wasn't sure it was that simple. The past and present were colliding, and Amelia knew one thing with certainty: whatever happened next, she couldn't let Michael slip through the cracks again. The courtroom was a battleground now. The prosecution had brought their first key witness, a middle-aged convenience store clerk who had been working the night of the alleged crime. His demeanor was stoic, but his voice wavered slightly as he recounted the events. "I saw him come in," the clerk said, glancing toward Michael briefly before looking away. "He had this energy about him, like he was angry. Then he jumped over the counter and—" The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man with a voice like a whip, stepped forward. "And what did he do next?" "He started grabbing at the cash register. I tried to stop him, and that's when he hit me." The jury shifted in their seats, murmurs rippling through the spectators. Amelia kept her expression neutral, but inside, a knot of unease tightened. The clerk's testimony felt rehearsed, the details too perfectly aligned with the prosecution's narrative. Yet the bruises on his face and the surveillance footage were difficult to ignore. Lisa Porter rose for cross-examination, her movements measured and deliberate. "Mr. Jennings," she began, her voice calm but pointed, "you mentioned that the suspect wore a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you're certain that this man," she gestured toward Michael, "was the one wearing that hoodie?" The clerk hesitated, his fingers twitching on the edge of the witness stand. "I mean, he matches what I saw." Lisa stepped closer, her tone sharpening. "Matches what you saw, or what you were told. Did you see his face clearly?" "Well, no," Jennings admitted reluctantly. The hood was up, and the store was dimly lit. "So, to be clear, you're identifying my client based solely on the color of his hoodie and a vague impression of his build." The clerk's mouth opened, then closed. Finally, he muttered, "I guess so." Lisa turned toward the jury, her eyes scanning their faces as she delivered her final blow. "No further questions, Your Honor." Amelia gave a slight nod, signaling the witness to step down. Her eyes darted toward Michael. He sat stoic, his jaw tight, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. This wasn't just a trial for him. It was a lifetime of fighting against assumptions and prejudice distilled into one defining moment. The next witness was Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. He took the stand with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight, but there was something off in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that Amelia didn't miss. Lisa wasted no time. "Officer Harris," she began, pacing slowly, "you stated in your report that you apprehended my client 2 blocks from the scene of the crime. What led you to believe he was the suspect?" Harris folded his arms. He fit the description we were given: a black male, mid-30s, wearing a red hoodie. Lisa paused, letting the room absorb the weight of that statement. "That's it?" "A vague description based on race, age, and clothing. Did you find any other evidence connecting him to the crime?" Harris hesitated. "We recovered some cash." "Did the cash match the amount stolen from the register?" "Not exactly." Lisa pounced. "So, no weapon, no identifiable items from the store, no red hoodie recovered, and an amount of cash that didn't match the stolen sum. Yet you arrested my client. Why?" Harris's jaw tightened. "Because he looked suspicious." Lisa stopped pacing and faced the officer, her voice quiet but cutting. "Suspicious or convenient?" The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Amelia's hand hovered over her gavel, ready to restore order, but she hesitated. The tension was palpable, the jury visibly unsettled. Lisa had driven a wedge into the prosecution's narrative, and everyone knew it. The prosecution tried to regain control, presenting the grainy surveillance footage that showed a figure in a red hoodie jumping the counter. But the quality was so poor it could have been anyone. The defense countered with a forensic analyst, who highlighted discrepancies in the video's timestamp, raising doubts about its integrity. When Michael took the stand, the room fell silent. His voice was quiet but firm as he recounted his version of events. "I didn't rob that store," he said, looking directly at the jury. "I was walking home after visiting a friend. The next thing I know, cops are throwing me against a wall, accusing me of something I didn't do." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "Do you know what it's like to be judged before you even open your mouth? To feel invisible, except when someone decides you're guilty of something?" Amelia felt her throat tighten. She had to force herself to remain composed, but Michael's words echoed in her mind, stirring memories she had spent years burying. The defense rested, and the court adjourned for the day. As the room emptied, Amelia lingered, watching Michael being led out in handcuffs. His eyes flicked toward her briefly, and for a moment the weight of their shared history pressed down on her like an unrelenting tide. This trial wasn't just about Michael's innocence. It was about a system that had failed him, and others like him long before he ever set foot in her courtroom. And Amelia was beginning to question whether justice, as she had always known it, was enough. The courtroom was thick with tension as the defense and prosecution prepared to deliver their closing arguments. The air felt heavy, as though everyone present could feel the weight of what was at stake, not just for Michael, but for the credibility of the justice system itself. Amelia sat at the bench, her expression a mask of professionalism, but inside she was a storm of conflicting emotions. Memories of Michael's laughter as a boy, of the promises they had made to each other under the wide Louisiana skies, mingled with the stark reality of the man now sitting in her courtroom, shackled and weary. She tightened her grip on her gavel, willing herself to stay focused. Lisa Porter rose first, her every step measured and deliberate. She paused in front of the jury, letting the silence build before she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but charged with emotion, "this case is about more than a convenience store robbery. It's about assumptions, about the dangerous ease with which we can judge someone based on surface-level perceptions." She gestured toward Michael, who sat stoically at the defense table. "My client, Michael Lewis, is not a perfect man. He has a past, as we all do, but having a past does not make him guilty of this crime. The prosecution has presented a case riddled with holes and unreliable witness, a grainy video that could depict anyone, and a police officer who admitted to basing his arrest on little more than a vague description. Lisa paused, letting her words sink in. The jury's eyes were fixed on her now, their faces a mixture of doubt and contemplation. The prosecution wants you to believe that's enough to convict a man, to strip him of his freedom, his dignity, and his future. But it's not enough. The burden of proof lies with them, and they have not met it. I urge you to see the man behind the accusations, to recognize the human cost of getting this wrong. Do not let prejudice, fear, or assumption dictate your verdict. Look at the facts or lack thereof and do what is right. She returned to her seat, her shoulders square, her expression resolute. Michael turned to her, his eyes brimming with quiet gratitude. The prosecutor, Richard Miller, stood next, his demeanor sharp and commanding. He adjusted his tie before addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense would have you believe this is a case of mistaken identity, of bias clouding judgment. But let's not lose sight of the facts. A man fitting Mr. Lewis's description was seen on surveillance footage. The clerk identified him as the assailant, and he was apprehended mere blocks from the crime scene with cash in his possession. Miller's voice grew more forceful as he continued. Yes, the evidence isn't perfect, but crimes rarely come with a neatly tied bow of certainty. The law does not demand perfection, it demands reason. And it is reasonable to conclude, based on the evidence presented, that Michael Lewis committed this crime. He turned to the jury, his tone almost pleading now. Justice is about protecting our community. If we let this man walk free, what message does that send to victims, to store owners, to everyone who relies on our system to hold people accountable? Amelia observed the jury as Miller spoke. Some nodded slightly, while others appeared unconvinced, their expressions guarded. She could see the internal battle waging within them, the tension between doubt and the need for resolution. When the arguments concluded, Amelia called for a recess, giving the jury time to deliberate. The courtroom emptied, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She sat at her bench, staring at the polished wood of her gavel. For the first time in her career, she felt utterly unmoored. The law was supposed to be clear, impartial, just. But now it felt fragile, as though it could shatter under the weight of human imperfection. Hours passed before the jury returned. The room filled once more, the buzz of anticipation crackling like static electricity. Michael sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Lisa leaned over to whisper something to him, her expression calm but her eyes betraying a hint of anxiety. Amelia took a deep breath, her voice steady as she addressed the jury. Have you reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held a slip of paper. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom fell silent, the tension almost unbearable. Amelia unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the verdict before passing it back to the clerk. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Michael Lewis, the foreperson said, her voice breaking slightly, we find the defendant. The pause felt eternal. Not guilty. The words echoed in the courtroom, setting off a wave of murmurs and gasps. Michael's head dropped, his shoulders shaking as he exhaled a deep, shuddering breath. Lisa reached out to place a steadying hand on his back, her face a mixture of relief and pride. Amelia banged her gavel. Order in the court. The room quieted, though the tension lingered in the air. She turned to Michael, her voice firm but tinged with something softer. Mr. Lewis, you are free to go. Michael looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the trial began. There was gratitude in his gaze, but also something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement of the years, the distance, the fractured paths that had led them here. As he was escorted out to finalize his release, Amelia watched him go, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. The jury's decision had affirmed his innocence in this case, but she knew the scars he carried from a lifetime of battles would not fade so easily. When the courtroom finally emptied, Amelia sat alone, the echoes of the trial still reverberating in her mind. Justice had been served, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the system had barely done its job, that Michael's freedom had come not as a certainty, but as a precarious reprieve. This case had opened old wounds and exposed deep flaws. For Amelia, it was no longer enough to uphold the law. It was time to change it. The courtroom had emptied, but the weight of the trial lingered in the air like a storm refusing to pass. Amelia Carter sat at her bench, staring at the polished surface where her gavel rested. Justice had been served, but the victory felt fragile, as if it could crumble under the weight of all the questions the trial had raised. She stood and returned to her chambers, the quiet solitude offering little solace. The knock on her door startled her. It was Margaret, her assistant, peeking in. "Judge Carter," Margaret said gently, "Michael Lewis is still in the courthouse. He asked to see you. I told him it wasn't protocol, but—" Amelia hesitated, the professional wall she had built around herself trembling. Finally she nodded. "Send him in." Moments later, Michael stepped into her chambers, his presence filling the room with a quiet intensity. He was no longer shackled, no longer weighed down by the physical chains of the system, but the invisible chains, the ones forged by years of struggle, still clung to him. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Michael broke it. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he said, his voice low but steady. "But I couldn't leave without saying thank you." Amelia straightened. "The jury made their decision, Michael. I didn't influence that." He smiled faintly, the same boyish smile she remembered from summers long past. "Maybe not, but you gave me something I haven't felt in a long time. A fair shot." Amelia felt her throat tighten. "You shouldn't have needed one. It shouldn't have taken all of this for the truth to come out." Michael nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You're right. It shouldn't have. But that's not the world we live in, is it?" "No," she admitted softly. "It's not." Michael stepped closer, his hands clasped in front of him. "You know, I've spent a lot of time being angry. At the system, at the world, at you." Amelia flinched but didn't look away. "I don't blame you." His voice softened. "But sitting in that courtroom, I realized something. That anger doesn't fix anything. It just keeps you stuck." Amelia felt the sting of his words, not as an accusation, but as a truth she hadn't fully confronted herself. "What are you going to do now?" Michael exhaled, the weight of the question pressing on him. "I don't know. I've spent so much of my life fighting to survive. I never thought about what living might look like. But maybe it's time I figure that out." Amelia stepped around her desk, standing just a few feet from him. "If you ever need help, Michael, with anything, you know where to find me." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I appreciate that, Amelia. But I think I need to learn how to stand on my own." She nodded, pride and sorrow mingling in her chest. "You've always been strong, Michael. Stronger than anyone gave you credit for." His smile returned, warmer this time. "Guess I'll just have to prove it then." They stood there for a moment longer, two people bound by a shared past and a fraught present, before Michael turned to leave. As he reached the door, he paused. "You know," he said without turning back, "we always talked about getting out of Hammond. Never thought it'd take me this long to start." Amelia's voice was steady but soft. "It's never too late, Michael." He nodded and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Amelia sank into her chair, her gaze fixed on the empty space he had left behind. The trial was over, but the fight for true justice for Michael, and for so many others like him, was just beginning. Weeks later. Amelia sat at her desk late one evening, the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating a stack of files. Among them was a letter addressed to her in careful handwriting. She opened it, her heart catching as she read the familiar name at the bottom. "Dear Amelia, I've started over. It's not easy, but it's a start. Got a job at a community center here in New Orleans, helping kids who've been through some of the same things I've faced. Feels good to do something that matters. I'm not writing this to ask for anything. Just wanted you to know I'm trying. You believed in me enough to give me a chance, and I don't want to waste it. Thank you for everything. Michael." Amelia set the letter down, her chest tight with a mix of emotions. She leaned back, staring out the window at the city lights. Michael was finding his way, and in his journey she found a renewed sense of purpose. She picked up her phone, dialing a number she had been considering for days. When the voice on the other end answered, she spoke with quiet determination. "This is Judge Amelia Carter. I'd like to talk about starting a community outreach program at the courthouse. Something to help those coming through our system before it's too late." Justice wasn't just about verdicts. It was about change, and for Amelia, change started now. And now, join the movement for justice. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and make these stories a part of your daily life. Together we can create change.